All right, everybody, this should be the third and final lesson for Indian independence. Um, your first assignment really covered a lot of the historical background or the historical context leading up to imperialism by Great Britain and then ultimately leading up to the Indian independence, the desire for independence. Your second assignment was on Gandhi. It was the brief biography video, and you should have done a Google form. And this is the third and final lesson. We're going to start with talking about the Indian National Congress that you see here. Moving on to the Muslim League, and then how India was divided into two different partitions, India and Pakistan. At this point in history, Pakistan does not exist, and Pakistan is created out of the religious conflict that exists between the Muslims and the Hindus. So it's very important for this lesson for you to understand what led to that partition and how that affects us even today. Not just us, but the entire world. What does this mean globally? What is going on in India currently today as a result of what happened 60, 70 years ago? So the Indian National Congress is founded in 1885. It was originally made up of 73 Western educated Indians, such as lawyers, teachers, journalists, and they formed the Indian National Congress. This group supported the British Raj, or the British government, imperial government over India, and mostly met to discuss issues that were concerns for urban and elite Indians, but were not controversial. This group wrote papers suggesting changes to British colonial government and submitted them for review, but they had little success. So ultimately, at its early stages, the Indian National Congress really didn't have much power or influence over the British government. In the early 1900s, a sense of nationalism grew. Some congressmen supported the British but wanted more say in the government and administration in India. Others advocated for Swaraj, or self-rule. In the early 1900s, those still loyal to the British won out. So still, we've got the sense of growing nationalism, but there's not real power within this Congress. So in the Edpuzzle, what I'd like you to answer is, what was the goal of the Indian National Congress in the early 1900s? All right. The Muslim League, 1906. The Muslim League is formed. While the Indian National Congress was dominated by Hindu Indians and their concerns, the Muslim League is formed. Hindu nationalists and leading members of the upper-class Muslim community formed the Muslim League in 1906. Wait a second. All right, in 1906, the Muslim League is formed, and this is the answer to the Indian National Congress. The Indian National Congress was nominated by Hindu Indians and their concerns. Meanwhile, leading members of the upper-class Muslim community formed the Muslim League. They petitioned the British for more say in the government, for Indian Muslims, and for laws and policies that would favor the people they represented. So in the Edpuzzle, I want you to answer, how was the Muslim League different from the Indian National Congress? And what was the purpose of the Muslim League? All right, I want to talk briefly about the Salt March. Gandhi led a massive boycott on British salt. the British would tax Indians a high tax on salt, where the Indians could get their own salt by going to the sea. But the British was making hand over fist through taxing the salt. So this angered Indians a great deal. So it started out with a simple boycott, not buying British salt and making their own. Well, people were beaten, arrested by the British government, British police, or even by the sepoys, the Indian soldiers who were hired by the British Army. So Gandhi led what became known as the Salt March. It was about a 240-mile march to the sea, and it lasted for several days. And a large group of Indians marched to the sea, and they made their own salt at the beaches of the sea. We're gonna try to watch this video. Hopefully it'll work.
Who often does beget violence, but a rebellion need not rely on guns to be successful, as Gandhi proved during his Salt March, the most peaceful rebellion. The sea, the abundant, free resource at land's end. Among its potential gifts, untold quantities of salt, waiting to be distilled. But for the poor of India in the early 20th century, even this basic necessity of life, salt, was not a given. It was being heavily taxed by their British rulers. Indians could even be thrown in jail for just making or selling this vital preservative. In 1930, Mahatma Gandhi saw this injustice as the perfect opportunity to practice the kind of passive resistance he called satyagraha.
By satyagraha, Gandhi meant truth force. He meant mobilizing the power of truth. So in other words, he had to find a way in which the people would free themselves, yet wasn't violent.
On March 12th, the 61-year-old Gandhi set out with 78 followers on a 240-mile trek to the sea. For 23 days, they marched. Thousands upon thousands of his countrymen joining along the way. Eventually, the throng of protesters reached over 2 miles.
Ultimately, then, you reach the sea, and what's he going to do? He's going to break the law. And sure enough, they go down, and with this wonderful simplicity, they make salt. The law's been broken. Wait a second, you mean British law can be defied? Yes.
Soon, people all over India were making their own salt. The authorities responded by imprisoning over 60,000 Indians for this illegal activity, including Gandhi himself. But that too was part of his plan to make the world aware of British oppression. India would not gain independence for another 17 years, but Gandhi proved that nonviolent methods on a vast scale could be used to achieve that most basic of human rights, freedom. The modern and free state of India, the world's largest democracy, is the lasting legacy of Gandhi's Salt March, history's most peaceful rebellion. Gandhi was assassinated in 1948, but his ideals of peaceful rebellion were passed on to other leaders in the fight for human freedom, including Dr. Martin Luther King. Sadly, he too met with an assassin's bullet. Stay tuned. Here's what's coming up next.
Soon after the Salt March ended, Gandhi was arrested. The protests against the salt tax continued. Gandhi's followers non-violently marched toward the British salt works in Gujarat, where they were beaten by Indian soldiers employed by the British Army. The Salt March and protests that followed it brought worldwide attention to the Indian independence movement and British cruelty. The media attention turned public opinion in Great Britain in Gandhi's favor and led to his release from prison, negotiations with the British government in India, and more support for Indian self-rule. In the Ed Puzzle, I'd like you to answer, why did Gandhi lead the Salt March? And what were the lasting effects of the Salt March? The Partition of India. Despite Gandhi's desire to keep India together, the decision was made to divide the colony into two separate and independent nations, India and Pakistan. The separation of India and Pakistan is known as the Partition of India. Pakistan gained its independence on August 14, 1947, and was led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. India gained its independence on August 15, 1947, and was led by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru.